reality is the main story, but the most interesting things have always been off the beaten path. Welcome to Side Quests of Reality, the paranormal investigation podcast for people who know the official story is never the whole story.
Imagine you're out there guarding the perimeter of a base. And, well, this isn't just any base. It's housing tactical nuclear weapons. And we are at the absolute height of the Cold War.
Right. And it's 1980.
Exactly. 1980. You're out in the freezing dark of this dense English pine forest. So your eyes, your training, your entire psychological framework, it's all calibrated for a very specific type of threat.
You're looking for Soviet saboteurs, basically.
Yeah, you're listening for the crunch of boots. You think a Spetsnaz commando unit is about to breach the runway? But tonight the threat doesn't come through the wire.
It drops right out of the sky.
A glowing, metallic, triangular craft drops silently through the canopy and lands right on the forest floor. And you're the one who has to walk up to it. You have to record it. And man, you have to live with what happens next.
Which is, yeah, that's a lot to live with.
It really is. So if you're here with us today, it's because you want to get past all those internet rumors. You know, the campfire ghost stories. You want the actual substance.
We're doing a deep dive into a really meticulous case study from Side Quests of Reality. We're pulling apart the Rendlesham Forest incident,
which is widely considered the most documented anomalous event in human history. So what exactly is our mission for this deep dive?
Well, our mission is strictly analytical. We're treating all of this data with the utmost seriousness. The goal is to analyze the shoe texture of this event.
Texture, I like that. Because we aren't talking about some lone civilian writing a blog post about a weird light.
No, not at all. We're looking at formal, classified military memos. We're analyzing real-time audio recordings made by high-ranking officers right in the field.
Physical ground traces, radiation readings, official government medical records. We've got all of it.
We do. Our objective is to take a measured approach, apply real forensic scrutiny, and basically just let the documented facts speak for themselves.
Okay, so to do that forensically, you really have to establish the context first. You have to understand the environment that produced all this data.
Right. The geography is key here.
Geographically, we are in Rendlesham Forest. That's in Suffolk, on the eastern coast of England. It's this massive, dark pine plantation. And crucially, it borders two massive U.S. Air Force installations.
Operating under NATO command, right. RAF Bentwaters to the north and RAF Woodbridge to the west.
Exactly. And the dates are the nights of December 26th through the 28th, 1980. Freezing, isolated area. But strategically, it might as well have been the center of the universe.
Oh, the strategic significance of that location. You just can't overstate it. In 1980, the tension between the West and the Soviet Union dictated absolutely every military protocol.
It was everything.
Right. And Bentwaters and Woodbridge together, they formed one of the most vital American military strongholds in all of Europe. They housed squadrons of A-10 Thunderbolt aircraft.
Those are the heavy armored attack jets, right, designed to stop a Soviet tank invasion.
Exactly. But furthermore, there were these persistent rumors, understood by the personnel but never officially confirmed, of course, that these bases housed a stockpile of tactical nuclear weapons.
Wow. See, that nuclear aspect, that changes the entire baseline of credibility for this case.
It really does.
If you have a highly secure perimeter protecting tactical nukes, your radar systems and your patrols are operating at maximum sensitivity. Colonel Ted Conrad and his deputy, Lieutenant Colonel Charles the Thirst Halt, they ran an incredibly tight ship.
A very tight ship.
Yeah.
So when a guard on that perimeter reports an anomaly, we have to recognize that this guard is not just some civilian predisposed to panic.
Right. They're trained observers. They know what a commercial airliner looks like.
They know what a helicopter sounds like. They know the flight patterns of their own aircraft.
So how does that psychological calibration, how does that shift how we view this? Because if I'm a guard, my baseline for stranger danger is a Soviet spy, not a UFO.
That's a great point. Security personnel at a potential nuclear site are trained to filter out the noise. They identify specific earthly threats.
Right.
So a breach in that perimeter isn't just trespassing. It has the potential to trigger an international incident. Therefore, when these highly trained guys report an event that fundamentally defies their whole operational framework,
the weight of that observation is just immense.
It is. It forces us to look very closely at the timeline of that first night when the perimeter was actually initially breached.
Let's get into the mechanics of that first night then. It's roughly 3:00 a.m. on December 26th. A security patrol near the east gate sees lights descending into the forest.
And given their training, they apply the most logical binary explanation they have. They assume a military aircraft crashed into the pines.
Naturally, it's an emergency response. 3 men are dispatched to investigate. Sergeant Jim Peniston, Airman First Class John Burroughs, and Airman Ed Cabinsag.
So Cabinsag stays back near the truck, right?
Yeah, to act as a radio relay, because the radio signals are already starting to degrade the deeper they go into the trees. So Peniston and Burroughs proceed on foot into the dark.
And they don't find a crashed jet.
No. They find the farm animals on the edge of the forest going into an absolute chaotic frenzy. And then they see the object.
And the divergence in the depth of their accounts here is fascinating to analyze. John Burroughs provides a statement the following year describing the woods lighting up with these chaotic red and blue lights.
Near the farmer's house, right?
Yeah. He details climbing over a fence, moving toward the lights, only for them to vanish. It's an unsettling account. But Sergeant Peniston's account pushes past just observation.
He describes a direct physical encounter with a structured craft. Peniston is incredibly specific, which is exactly what you'd expect from a military policeman filing a report.
Right, he gives dimensions.
He does. He describes a triangular craft resting on 3 legs in a small clearing. He estimates it at 9 feet long and 6 feet high. But the material he describes, that's what catches my attention.
It wasn't aluminum or steel.
No, he describes a smooth, black, glass-like material, and the surface is covered in these hieroglyphic-like symbols, the largest being a triangle within a circle.
So he's not just giving a vague description of a glowing orb, he's giving us the architectural dimensions of a machine.
Exactly. He provides structural data.
And then he initiates the most controversial action of the entire first night. He walks up to the object and physically touches it.
Wait, he just walks up and touches it?
He does. He reports that the metallic surface felt warm to the touch. And when he runs his hand over the symbols, he describes a sudden, intense buildup of static electricity.
Wow.
And this is followed immediately by what he calls a total whiteout.
I want to look at the neurology of that for a second, because a whiteout isn't just a bright flash. He describes a complete sensory override.
He loses his sight, his hearing, his spatial awareness.
He's just engulfed in a blinding white environment, totally isolated for an indeterminate amount of time. And when his sensory processing finally resets, he's standing next to the craft again.
And that's when it moves. The object lifts about 4 feet off the forest floor, retracts its 3 legs, and silently maneuvers its way through the dense pine branches.
Which, that implies a localized manipulation of inertia or gravity, right? Because it just ascends above the tree line and shoots off at an impossible speed.
Right. And the aftermath of that sensory override on Peniston's psychology is profound. He returns to the base, but his brain is effectively stuck in a processing loop.
Like a glitch. He can't sleep.
He can't sleep at all. He experiences this relentless, waking intrusion of visual data. He starts seeing continuous strings of 1s and 0s. Binary code.
Just flashing in his head.
Exactly. The visual intrusion is so severe that he's compelled to write it down. He takes a standard Air Force notebook and fills 16 pages with his binary sequence.
That is wild.
And only after he externalizes the data onto the paper does the visual loop stop. And importantly, he hides this notebook. He refuses to speak about the binary aspect for the next 30 years.
See, if I'm listening to this and filtering it through a purely skeptical lens, my immediate thought is psychological trauma. The guy is freezing, sleep-deprived, high on adrenaline, and he touches something unknown.
A stress-induced breakdown, basically.
Right. Maybe the static shock triggered a temporary neurological break. You hallucinate the whiteout, get an obsessive-compulsive urge to write 1s and 0s. You could write it off entirely.
You could, but you can't. Because a subjective hallucination doesn't leave physical architecture behind in the dirt.
Exactly. The physical environment anchors the psychological claim. Because at first light, investigators return to those exact coordinates.
And they find 3 distinct geometric depressions punched into the frozen soil. The indentations form a perfect equilateral triangle.
You can't hallucinate holes in the ground. The structural mechanics are entirely consistent with a heavy physical object coming to rest on 3 load-bearing legs.
Right. The subjective experience is suddenly backed by measurable physical displacement. And when a military patrol finds physical anomalies near a nuclear perimeter,
a specific mechanism of bureaucracy has to kick in. A deputy base commander cannot just shrug at irradiated dirt and broken branches.
No, he is legally and professionally bound to create a paper trail. The physical footprint necessitates a bureaucratic response. Which brings us to January 13th, 1981.
Roughly 2 weeks after the events.
Yes. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt, the Deputy Base Commander, authors a formal memorandum addressed to the UK Ministry of Defence. It's a single page, officially titled Unexplained Lights.
The tone of this memo is vital to understand. It isn't frantic. It's written in the clipped, incredibly cautious syntax of a senior military officer.
He knows exactly how much risk he is taking by putting his signature on this paper.
It's basically career suicide unless he's absolutely certain of his facts. He outlines the descent of the object on the first night. He details the physical discovery of the 3 depressions.
He documents the anomalous radiation readings taken at the site. And finally, he outlines his own direct experience in the forest on the 3rd night.
And when this specific piece of paper was declassified and released via FOIA in 1983, it fundamentally altered the public's understanding of the case. It became Britain's Roswell.
Because the existence of the memo serves as formal, institutional acknowledgement. A senior officer at a NATO installation risked his career and his pension to officially report a breach by an inexplicable craft.
But skeptics validly argue that a memo is a retrospective document. It was written 13 days after the fact.
Right. Human memory is fallible, and bureaucratic summaries can inadvertently distort ground-level realities.
I completely agree with the skeptics on the limitations of a retrospective memo. But here's the thing. The memo isn't the primary evidence, it's just the table of contents.
Because Lieutenant Colonel Halt didn't just rely on his memory.
No, he captured the reality of the event as it unfolded in real time. Let's look at the events of the 3rd night, moving into the early hours of December 28th.
Halt is attending a formal officers' holiday dinner. The base is actively attempting to maintain operational normalcy despite the rumors from the first night.
But during the dinner, a junior officer interrupts and informs Halt that the anomalous lights have returned to the forest.
The protocol kicks in immediately. Halt leaves the dinner, changes into his field gear, and assembles a team to head back into the freezing woods.
And he brings a piece of technology that changes the entire nature of this case. A handheld micro-cassette recorder. He intends to dictate his notes for his official report.
For the next several hours, he clicks this recorder on and off to conserve battery life while they investigate. What survives is an 18-minute continuous audio record of a multi-hour military investigation.
Listening to the tape requires an understanding of field science. The audio is not dramatic initially. You just hear the methodical, procedural sounds of men trying to quantify the unknown.
You hear the clicking of a Geiger counter as they sweep the landing site from the first night. Halt dictates his observations, noting that the tree tissue appears twisted.
Right, suggesting massive downward pressure. And he observes crystalline pine sap bleeding rapidly from the bark. Let's talk about the biological mechanism behind that sap.
Yeah, that's crucial.
Pine sap doesn't just spontaneously crystallize and pour out of a tree on a freezing December night. That requires a sudden, intense application of localized heat.
Or microwave radiation.
Exactly. To instantly boil the moisture inside the tree, forcing the sap out through the bark where it freezes into crystals. They also document that the broken branches on the surrounding trees all face inward.
Toward the center of the clearing.
Right. A localized wind or a storm shears branches in one direction. Branches forced inward indicate a solid object descended straight down into the canopy, pushing the foliage away from its center of mass.
They're meticulously documenting the physical footprint. But roughly 2/3 of the way through the recording, the nature of the investigation transitions.
It goes from forensic analysis to an active encounter.
Yes. The audio captures a Lieutenant England calling out a visual on an object. He directs Halt's attention straight ahead, through the trees.
This is where the audio becomes chilling. Halt's voice comes onto the tape, and he is actively tracking a light maneuvering through the pines. He estimates it is a quarter to a half mile out.
He orders his team to extinguish their flashlights to prevent light pollution. Then he deploys a starlight scope.
Right, the early military night vision technology. It amplifies ambient photons to allow visibility in near total darkness. Looking through the scope, he calls out the bearings of an object.
And it's popping into existence, vanishing and reappearing, moving in a manner that fundamentally defies the mechanics of human aviation.
The scope of the incursion then escalates dramatically. Halt dictates the sudden appearance of 3 distinct objects high in the sky. He described them exhibiting red, green, and blue lights.
But more importantly, he notes their movement. Sharp, erratic, angular maneuvers. This indicates a complete absence of the inertia that governs conventional aircraft.
And then the event reaches its climax. HALT records in real time that one of these objects hovers and sends a concentrated laser-like beam of light directly down into the base's weapons storage area.
The exact bunker complex where the tactical nuclear weapons were supposedly stored.
This is where you really have to examine the psychology of the audio itself. Let's play devil's advocate. Could a group of freezing, exhausted men, already primed by the rumors of Night One, experience a sort of group contagion?
Right. Could the sensory deprivation of the dark woods cause them to hyperfixate on a normal stimulus and collectively panic? Contagion and collective panic are well-documented psychological phenomena.
Especially in high-stress military environments, but the tone of Halt's voice systematically dismantles that theory.
It really does. When he describes a beam of light striking a potential nuclear depot, his voice does not elevate in pitch. He doesn't sound panicked.
He maintains a rigid, stubborn professionalism. He is actively fighting to force an impossible event into a framework of military observation. You're hearing the raw, unedited processing of a commander dealing with a severe security threat.
And the existence of that 18-minute tape forces the authorities into a corner. If the deputy base commander is recording anomalous crafts probing his nuclear bunkers, the government has to provide an official explanation.
They have to debunk it. And the official explanations offered over the years are fascinating because, individually, they rely on perfectly logical atmospheric and environmental mechanics.
The official debunking strategy relies on isolating the events. They apply separate natural phenomena to each component. First, the descending lights observed on December 26th.
They attribute those to a fireball meteor, right?
Yes. Astronomical records confirm that a remarkably bright meteor was observed over southern England around that time.
Okay, a meteor explains a sudden bright streak of light entering the atmosphere. But a meteor burns up. It doesn't hover in the trees. So how do they explain the flashing lights Penniston and Burroughs chased through the woods?
For the ground-level lights, officials point to the Orfordness Lighthouse. This was a powerful lighthouse situated on the coast, several miles away.
And its beams swept across the horizon in the direction of Rendlesham Forest.
Right. The theory suggests that the men, disoriented by the dense, dark woods, saw the lighthouse beams strobing through the pine trunks and optically misidentified it as a structured moving object.
But if you look at a map, the lighthouse theory has massive geographical flaws. To see the Orfordness Lighthouse from that specific clearing, you have to look through miles of dense timber.
Not to mention, a lighthouse is a fixed rotating beam. It operates on a predictable, rhythmic frequency.
Exactly. Penniston and Burroughs were military police. Their entire job was pattern recognition. Suggesting they chased a stationary lighthouse beam for hours, thinking it was a 9-foot metallic triangle. I mean, it insults their baseline competence.
It really does. But let's look at the third explanation. How do the skeptics explain the objects Halt tracked with night vision on the third night?
The explanation for the third night relies on atmospheric distortion. Skeptics argue that Halt and his men were observing bright, low-hanging stars, such as Sirius.
Right, because when starlight passes through the Earth's turbulent atmosphere, it refracts, causing the star to appear to change colors, flashing red, blue, and green.
Furthermore, the natural rotation of the Earth, combined with the movement of clouds and the observers themselves, can create a powerful optical illusion called the autokinetic effect,
where a stationary point of light in a dark sky appears to dart and move erratically.
Let's apply a military intelligence analogy here. In intelligence gathering, you sometimes have sensor failure. A radar array glitches and shows a ghost plane, but you verify it with a secondary system, like thermal imaging.
And if the thermal shows nothing, you know the radar failed.
Exactly. What the skeptics are proposing here is a catastrophic, cascading failure of every biological and technological sensor across 3 separate nights.
That is the concept of compound nature that our source article beautifully articulates. The explanations are locally plausible, but collectively inadequate.
It's like trying to explain away a bank robbery by saying the alarm malfunctioned because of a squirrel, the vault opened due to a seismic anomaly, and the missing money was eaten by moths.
Individually, maybe. Collectively. It strains credulity. A meteor does not possess the physical mass to compress frozen soil into 3 geometric depressions.
And a lighthouse beam cannot decouple from its tower, maneuver intelligently through a forest canopy, and trigger a localized static charge.
And stars do not descend from the upper atmosphere to shoot concentrated beams of light into an underground weapons bunker.
Right. To accept the official debunking, you have to believe that highly trained observers were simultaneously and repeatedly fooled by a meteor, a lighthouse, and twinkling stars.
And that these entirely unrelated phenomena coincidentally lined up to produce matching physical evidence and an 18-minute real-time tape. It requires a greater leap of faith to believe the coincidence than to simply accept the data.
And the data always points back to the dirt. The physical footprint remains the anchor. So let's return to the forensic evidence gathered from the landing site.
The 3 depressions were measured and photographed, establishing the physical geometry of the event. But the deeper confirmation comes from the radiological data.
Skeptics frequently attack the Geiger counter readings on Halt's tape, arguing that the absolute numbers he calls out are barely above the normal background radiation you'd find in any forest.
But analyzing the raw numbers misses the actual mechanism of the data. You have to look at the pattern.
The distribution, exactly. A Geiger-Müller tube measures ionizing radiation. If you're reading natural background radiation, the clicks will be relatively uniform across a given area.
But the data recorded by Halt's team showed a specific structured gradient. The radiation levels peaked exactly at the center of the 3 indentations and decreased systematically as the meter moved outward.
The localized radiation field perfectly mirrored the geometric footprint of the supposed craft. A natural background anomaly does not conform to the exact dimensions of a landing gear.
And then there's the soil chemistry, which is the absolute forensic linchpin of this entire case. Investigators took soil samples from those indentations.
And the chemical analysis revealed anomalous traces of calcium carbonate. Why is calcium carbonate in the pine needles? Because we know exactly what happened the morning after the first night.
Jim Peniston took plaster of Paris into the woods and poured it into those holes to make physical casts.
Exactly. The chemical mechanics of plaster of Paris dictate that when the powder mixes with water and cures, the evaporation process leaves behind specific chemical residues,
including calcium carbonate, in the surrounding soil.
That chemical signature proves, with absolute forensic certainty, that the investigative team, led by Halt on night 3, was standing over the exact same physical indentations that Peniston poured plaster into on night 1.
It physically bridges the 2 timelines. It utterly destroys the theory that the men were just wandering around hallucinating at different lighthouses.
Whatever dropped into that forest had enough physical mass to displace soil, enough thermal energy to boil tree sap, and enough structural reality to leave a moldable footprint.
And acknowledging that physical reality forces an incredibly sobering realization. If an object possesses the energetic capacity to manipulate inertia, irradiate soil, and scorch timber,
we must ask what that specific frequency of energy does to the cellular structure of a human being standing only a few feet away.
That brings us to the human cost. We are moving from the environmental footprint to the biological footprint left on the witnesses themselves.
The men who interacted with this anomaly did not just walk away with a strange story. Jim Peniston developed severe chronic post-traumatic stress disorder.
And Airman John Burroughs, who accompanied Peniston on that initial approach, developed cascading, life-threatening cardiovascular issues that ultimately required open-heart surgery.
The aftermath for these men involved a grueling, decades-long legal battle against the United States military and the Veterans Administration. Their objective was simply to gain access to their own medical files,
because the military had heavily classified the health records of the personnel involved in the Rendlesham incident.
Let's view that through the lens of Cold War bureaucracy. Why does a government classify the cardiac records of a security guard who supposedly just got confused by a lighthouse?
You don't classify a mistake. You classify a vulnerability. You classify exposure to an unknown technology.
Exactly. But the legal battle finally forced a reckoning. In 2015, the U.S. Veterans Administration issued an unprecedented legal ruling.
The mechanics of a VA disability ruling require an incredibly high burden of proof. A veteran must establish a direct service connection, linking their current medical condition to a specific event that occurred during their active duty.
And in 2015, the VA granted John Burroughs full medical disability. By legally establishing that service connection, the United States government officially conceded something huge.
They conceded that Burroughs' severe cardiac trauma was the direct result of his encounter with an unidentified anomalous phenomenon in Rendlesham Forest.
The government legally codified the reality of the UAP. It stopped being an X-file and became an occupational hazard case. And the medical specifics of that injury are terrifying.
A former CIA medical officer reviewed Burroughs' files and concluded that the cellular damage to his heart was caused by exposure to broadband, non-ionizing electromagnetic radiation.
To understand the biology of that, we have to differentiate between ionizing and non-ionizing radiation. Ionizing radiation, like an X-ray or gamma rays, has enough energy to strip electrons from atoms, directly damaging DNA.
Right. And non-ionizing radiation, like radio frequencies or microwaves, doesn't strip electrons. But in highly concentrated broadband doses, it aggressively heats biological tissue
And disrupts the electrical pathways of the nervous system. The sinoatrial node, the natural pacemaker of the human heart, relies on delicate electrical impulses.
So a massive dose of non-ionizing electromagnetic radiation can fundamentally scramble those pathways, leading to the exact type of catastrophic structural failure Burroughs experienced.
A former Ministry of Defense official stated on the record that this VA payout confirms Burroughs encountered a genuine, highly advanced technology that physically harmed him.
But if the electromagnetic field of that craft was powerful enough to cook the electrical pathways of Burroughs' heart from a distance,
What did that same energetic field do to the neurology of Jim Penniston, who walked right up and placed his bare hand directly onto the hull?
that physiological context makes Penniston's claims regarding his neurological trauma significantly more compelling. We must revisit the binary code.
Because for 30 years, Tennyson kept the 16 pages of ones and zeros hidden. When he finally allowed investigators to examine the notebook in 2010, the data was subjected to computational analysis.
The investigators took the pages of binary code and translated them using ASCII. For anyone unfamiliar, ASCII stands for American Standard Code for Information Interchange.
It's a character encoding standard developed in the 1960s. It takes standard English text and translates each letter into a specific 7-bit binary integer so a computer can read it.
And when they mapped Penniston's ones and zeros through the ASCII translation matrix, it didn't produce random gibberish. It produced a highly structured, coherent message.
The translated text reads, Exploration of humanity, continuous for planetary advance, eyes of our eyes, origin year 8100.
And in addition to this phrase, the binary sequence contained a highly specific list of geographic coordinates pointing to distinct locations across the globe.
The coordinates map out a global grid of humanity's most ancient and geometrically significant sites. We are talking about the Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt, the Nazca Lines in Peru,
The vortexes of Sedona in Arizona, the Mayan ruins of Caracol in Belize, the Temple of Apollo in Greece, the sacred mountain of Taishan in China,
and a specific oceanic coordinate off the coast of Ireland that correlates with the mythical Phantom Island of High Brazil.
Because of the specific inclusion of the phrase, origin year 8100, Penniston has publicly theorized that the craft he touched was not an extraterrestrial vehicle, but a temporal one.
He believes the intelligence operating the craft were human beings from 6,000 years in the future, traveling backward through time to conduct a historical or environmental survey.
It is a staggering hypothesis. However, our commitment to forensic analysis requires us to rigorously apply the skeptical arguments against the notebook.
The source material outlines several major red flags. First, forensic examination of the physical notebook suggests discrepancies with the dates and times recorded,
raising questions about whether the code was truly written in the immediate frantic aftermath of the 1980 encounter or generated years later.
Second, the message is highly poetic and vague, lacking the specific mathematical or scientific data one might expect from a vastly superior intelligence.
And third, the fundamental paradox of the encoding itself. Why would an intelligence from the year 8100, capable of manipulating time and space, choose to communicate using ASCII?
Right, a primitive, localized human computing convention from the mid-20th century.
It doesn't make logical sense on the surface.
The ASCII paradox is definitely the biggest hurdle. If you are an unimaginably advanced society, you don't use the equivalent of digital smoke signals to transmit data.
But, well, if we play devil's advocate and assume the premise of temporal communication, how does a highly advanced system interface with the primitive hardware of a human brain from 1980?
You have to use the protocols available in the local environment. If an intelligence is trying to download structural data into the mind of a 26-year-old security guard in the 1980s,
it might actively scan his environmental baseline and select the most prevalent binary language available on Earth at that exact moment to encode the message.
It is the paradox of the messenger versus the message. You have to weigh the improbability of the ASCII code against the psychological improbability of Jim Penniston inventing it.
In 1980, Penniston had zero background in computer science, programming, or binary mathematics. He was a military policeman focused on perimeter security.
The psychological profile does not fit a man who would meticulously construct a 16-page binary hoax that decodes into geographic coordinates.
Furthermore, the timeline of his silence is critical. If he perpetrated a hoax for fame or financial gain, he failed completely.
He hid the notebook during his prime earning years. He gained absolutely nothing from it and avoided the subject entirely until he was nearing the end of his life.
It leaves us in a maddening analytical space. The notebook is either the most profound data transfer in human history, or it is the most bizarre, patient, and unrewarding fabrication ever executed by a man who had zero motive to lie.
Regardless of its origin, the notebook fits seamlessly into the overarching architecture of the Rendlesham case. Suppressed information, delayed revelations, and institutional silence.
Which forces us to look at the aftermath and the exact shape of the government silence. The institutional aftermath is perhaps the most revealing data point of all.
We have to examine the trajectory of Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt. Throughout his military career, Halt remained a staunch conservative, rigidly adhering to the chain of command.
For decades, he refused to speculate publicly beyond the strict parameters of his official memo and the audio tape. But as he aged, and as the government continued to obfuscate the events, his public stance hardened significantly.
He didn't soften, he went on the offensive. Halt has stated in numerous interviews that the objects he tracked in that forest were definitively not of this earth.
He has publicly excoriated the official atmospheric debunking theories as entirely inadequate and logically insulting. He believes that the intelligence apparatus of both the US and the UK are fully aware of the reality of the incursion.
But the most staggering revelation Halt has made concerns the immediate aftermath of his report. He has stated on the record that, following his submission of the memo and the audio tape detailing a breach of a nuclear site.
Well, wait, you said no ellipses.
Right. I mean, following his report, he was never debriefed.
The absence of a debriefing is a massive structural anomaly in military protocol. You have the deputy base commander of a major NATO installation formally documenting that unknown aerial vehicles penetrated their airspace over 3 nights,
culminating in a craft firing an energetic beam into a weapons storage bunker. He provides physical data, radiation readings, and an audio record.
The mandatory protocol is immediate, aggressive interrogation by military intelligence. They should have isolated him in a secure room to extract every micro detail of the threat.
Instead, the military hierarchy did absolutely nothing. They asked no follow-up questions. They initiated no internal review with him.
Let's apply the logic of the Cold War to that silence. If a guard reports a stray dog near a nuclear bunker, he gets debriefed.
Exactly. The fact that a lieutenant colonel reported a highly advanced craft and met absolute silence implies a terrifying institutional reality.
It means the chain of command either already knew exactly what the objects were and therefore required no further intelligence from Halt,
or the implications of the event were so strategically destabilizing that the hierarchy decided the only safe bureaucratic move was to pretend it never happened.
Acknowledging that a UAP can casually bypass your nuclear security systems is a strategic vulnerability you cannot afford to put on the books while facing the Soviet Union.
The shape of that institutional silence is perfectly mirrored by the physical archives of the United Kingdom. We look to the UK Ministry of Defence, which has historically maintained extensive records of anomalous aerial phenomena.
A few years ago, the Ministry of Defense announced a major initiative for transparency, releasing 35 massive archives containing thousands of UFO-related documents to the public.
Researchers immediately sought out the comprehensive file on Rendlesham Forest, assuming it would be the crown jewel of the release. But the Ministry of Defense issued a stunning acknowledgement.
They stated that the complete primary file on the Rendlesham Forest incident had gone missing.
The language is critical. The file is not classified. It is not redacted. It is officially acknowledged as missing.
A highly secure government bureaucracy simply lost the primary investigative record of a multi-night incursion at a nuclear-capable NATO base involving personnel injuries and physical ground traces.
No explanation for the loss has ever been provided. It is the bureaucratic equivalent of a black hole.
And it brings us perfectly back to the core thesis of the Side Quests of Reality article that grounded this deep dive. The author makes a brilliant point.
Rendlesham is not the most spectacular UFO case on record. There are stories with massive motherships, dramatic abductions, and wild interstellar battles.
But Rendlesham is the most textured case in human history. Texture implies layers of corroboration that resist simple reduction.
The case is a convergence of multiple independent streams of data intersecting at a single point in time. If you approach this as a skeptic and try to strip away the anomaly, what happens?
You discard the fireball meteor because it doesn't leave ground depressions. You turn off the Orfordness Lighthouse because it doesn't boil pine sap.
You ignore the twinkling stars because they don't trigger Geiger counters. You discount the atmospheric explanations because they fundamentally fail to account for the physical mechanics of the event.
And when you strip all the tidy explanations away, you are not left with an empty forest. You are left with a mountain of forensic data.
You're left with plaster casts of geometric indentations. You're left with a legally binding VA medical ruling that attributes human heart failure to non-ionizing electromagnetic radiation from a UAP.
You're left with a frantic notebook filled with ASCII code. You're left with an 18-minute real-time audio tape of a commander tracking a physical impossibility.
And you're left with a glaring, inexplicable void in the archives of the Ministry of Defense, which is why engaging with this level of texture requires immense critical thinking.
In our current information landscape, it's incredibly easy to seek out the path of least resistance. We crave the clean diagnosis.
The lighthouse is a comforting, tidy answer. The meteor is a simple binary explanation. But when you apply rigorous forensic scrutiny to the primary sources, those tidy answers completely disintegrate.
The facts of the Rendlesham case refuse to conform to a comfortable reality. The evidence remains exactly where those military men found it in the freezing woods over 40 years ago.
Unresolved, complex, and fundamentally challenging our assumptions about what is possible. We started this deep dive talking about how much we all want the clean X-ray.
We want the doctor to point at the break and give us a simple, binary answer.
Rendlesham is the murky water that proves the X-ray machine doesn't always work. And as we wrap up today, I want to leave you with one final thought to process, something that builds entirely on the mechanics and the implications of everything we've analyzed today.
Something for you to really mull over.
If we entertain the paradox of Jim Peniston's notebook for a moment, if that ASCII translation was accurate, and the craft in that forest was actually driven by future humans returning from the year 8100 ACE, you have to ask yourself about their targeting data.
Why did they specifically choose to drop out of time on a freezing December night in 1980?
Specifically, to shine a concentrated beam of light into a Cold War tactical nuclear weapons storage facility. Were they merely conducting a passive historical survey of our era?
Or, looking back through the lens of history from 6,000 years in the future, were they actively checking on the exact weapons systems that determine whether humanity even survives long enough to make it to the year 8100 at all?
Think about that the next time you look up at the stars.
You've been listening to Side Quests of Reality. The full case file for this episode is available at www.sidequestsofreality.com. If this episode resonated with you, share it with someone who asks the right questions. Subscribe. The next case is already open and will be available soon.